How do we know stuff? That might seem like a simple question on the surface, but there's an entire field of philosophy called epistemology dedicated to exploring the topic. And in fact, there's a particular epistemological tool I want to look at today that's going to help us understand this topic. It's unfortunately been associated with noted war criminal, enhanced interrogation techniques supporter, and nutritious worm food Donald Rumsfeld. He didn't invent it, but it's come to be known as the Rumsfeld matrix. I guess you can separate the art from the artist when they're dead. Anyway, the Rumsfeld matrix looks at some different types of knowledge. The first is what we know we know. My name is Sophie. I'm recording a video in my studio. I'm holding translations of both the Iliad and the Odyssey in my hand. I know these things, and I'm also aware of my knowledge of them. We also know the Iliad and Odyssey were just a small part of the epic cycle of the Trojan War. We know there were several other epic poems that went along with it, taking place both before and after the Iliad. First, the Kypria, the judgment of Paris, which sparked the Trojan War and the first 9 years of the war. Then, of course, the Iliad, which we all know and love. After comes the Aethiopis, where Amazon and Ethiopian forces join the Trojan side of the war, and Achilles himself dies. Spoiler alert. There was the Little Iliad, which told the story of what happened after the death of Achilles, including the construction of the Trojan horse. Then the Ilioupersis, the actual destruction of Troy by the Greeks. There was the Nostoi, telling the tale of the Greek generals, except Odysseus, returning home. Then, of course, the Odyssey, and finally the Telegony, a final voyage of Odysseus to Thesprotia, return to Ithaca, and death at the hands of a son he didn't even know he had, Telegonus. We know these poems existed. They're referenced throughout classical literature, enough that we know the basic plot points. In the Hypsicrates video, we referenced 2 different poems called Post-Homerica, one by Quintus Smyrnaeus, the other by John Tzetzes. They both cover the events of most of the above poems after the Iliad, but before the Odyssey. These are things we know that we know. Then there are things we don't know that we don't know. It's knowledge that exists, in theory, but not only do we not know it, we aren't aware of its possibility as knowledge in the first place. It's hard to think of an ancient example of this, so let's consider the principles of nuclear fission. You know, the process of splitting an atom into 2 or more smaller pieces, creating an enormous amount of clean, sustainable energy. It wasn't until 1938 that humans figured out how to do it. 100 years before then, not only did we not know nuclear fission existed, we didn't even know we didn't know that nuclear fission existed. But it was always possible. In fact, nuclear fission can occur naturally, as is the case with Oklo in modern-day Gabon, West Africa, about 1.7 billion years ago. Did you know that? A naturally occurring nuclear reactor. Absolutely wild stuff. But even if nuclear fission had existed in the prehistoric past, it just wasn't something that had occurred to us to do yet. Finally, there's what we know that we don't know. Let's come back to those lost epic poems we talked about a moment ago. We have 30 surviving lines of the Little Iliad, for example, and we know the basics of what happened, but other than that, we don't know any of the words used in the poem. They were there once upon a time. Perhaps we'll rediscover a manuscript of them someday, but currently we don't know. But we at least know that we don't know. The field of classical studies spends quite a bit of time in this area. There's so much we know that we don't know. And that can apply to transgender history and mythology as well. In case this is your first time joining us, welcome. I'm Sophie, and this is We Have Always Existed. It's a series where we look at the wealth of transgender history and mythology from the ancient Mediterranean. Today we'll be living in the known unknowns as we take a look at the story of Siproites. If you've not heard of this one, you're not alone. It only survives in a single literary reference in an obscure ancient text called the Metamorphoses. Not this Metamorphoses. We've talked about Ovid a lot on this channel, and we're going to talk about him more today. Yes, I guarantee he's going to come up a lot in the future. But no, this Metamorphoses is the one we're interested in today. It's by Antoninus Liberalis. We'll start by exploring what we know about this author and his work. From there, we'll take a look at the tantalizingly tiny bit of information we know about Siproites and what we could possibly draw from it. As always, your support on Patreon makes a big difference in helping support this channel. This book was $90 with shipping, and it's not the only expensive and obscure book I've had to track down in the process of making these videos. So when I say your Patreon support helps this become more than a very expensive hobby, I'm not kidding. It is expensive to do this stuff, and I'm very grateful for your support. You can also support the channel by offering your likes, comments, and subscribes, or by purchasing a copy of my book, The Bottom Line, which is not $90, I promise. Trans people deserve to know and own our own histories. That's why this channel exists. If you think these stories are worth spreading, your likes, comments, and subscribes go a long way toward making that happen. Do it, you coward. What are you waiting for, Christmas? That was last week. Let's go already. Chapter 1. Antoninus Liberalis. When we look at an ancient source on this channel, I like to start by talking about the writer themselves. It's nice to remember that while it's only their writings that survive today, they were real, living, breathing human beings with lives as rich as our own. So here's what we know about Antoninus Liberalis. He wrote in Greek, but he had a Latin name. That's it. There are a few things we can guess about him, though. His first name, Antoninus, was more popular after the Emperor Antoninus Pius, who ruled from 138 to 161 CE. Most emperors have absolute train wrecks of names, so we shorten them to make it easier to remember. It's a lot easier to talk about Antoninus Pius than it is Imperator Caesar Titus Aelius Hadrianus Antoninus Augustus Pius. Some of them had the same name as well. For example, both Marcus Aurelius and Caracalla were named Imperator Caesar Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, and Imperator Caesar Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus I and Imperator Caesar Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus II is just a little inconvenient of a naming convention. But you see how the name Antoninus became popular. Commodus also had Antoninus in his name, and so did Diadumenianus and Elagabalus. After that, it seemed to fall out of vogue. No emperor after Elagabalus had the name Antoninus, but that wasn't because Elagabalus sullied the name of it or anything. They had the names Marcus and Aurelius as well, and tons of later emperors took on those names. So the name Antoninus seemed to be the most popular between the reigns of Antoninus Pius and Elagabalus, or 138 to 222 CE. As well, his last name, Liberalis, means befitting a libertus. Libertus, the feminine form is liberta, was a social class in Roman society. That meant a person who used to be a slave but gained their freedom through legal means. You might see them referred to as freedmen in other sources. It's the same thing. They were, in some cases, granted the same freedoms as a Roman citizen. In others, they were given Latin rights, which is like a step below citizenship. Based on all that, we suspect that Antoninus Liberalis lived some time after the reign of Antoninus Pius. He was a former slave who earned his freedom, and he was born somewhere where they spoke Greek predominantly. But there's currently no way to confirm any of it. The fact that he obviously could write might give us some hints about his life as well. Literacy was no means a given in the ancient world. It might have been more widespread than we think, however, considering how much graffiti we found in Pompeii and Herculaneum. Do you know about that? Graffiti in Pompeii and Herculaneum? Maybe you don't, but you should. I love this stuff. It's one of the most fascinating things in the world to me. In the video on eunuchs, I waxed poetic about how beautiful Pompeii and Herculaneum are, and the graffiti is a big part of that. We often have the impression that Roman civilization was this enlightened, erudite time of philosophers and high art. And it was, just as today is, but trans people aren't the only people who've always existed. Men who love men have always existed. On the side of the house of Orpheus, we found I have men. And on the side of a bar, weep, you girls, my has given you up. Now it penetrates men's behinds. Goodbye, wondrous femininity. Best friends have always existed. We found the following written on the side of a bar. We two dear men, friends forever, we're here. If you want to know our names, they are Gaius and Aulus. I love it. It's so cute. Best friends who hire hookers have always existed too. Two friends were here, and they had a servant named Epaphroditus, who was terrible at everything for the whole time, so they finally kicked him out. Then they spent 105.5 sestertii most delightfully when they had sex. Shit posters have always existed. We found I Secundus took a shit here, written 3 times on the same bathroom wall. Absolute champ. And in the basilica, the one who sodomizes a fire burns his penis. Wisdom for the ages. And apparently my girlfriend is a lot older than she says as well, because on the side of the house of Pinarius, we found, if anyone does not believe in Venus, they should gaze at my girlfriend. Gosh, I love her. Anyway, literacy tended to be higher in cities, which is why we got so much stuff like this in a city. But most people didn't live in cities, so they couldn't read or write. They didn't need to. Scholar William Harris estimates in his book, Ancient Literacy, that during the early Roman Empire, likely less than 10% of people were literate. So Antoninus Liberalis might have grown up in a city and had more of a privileged upbringing, having been given the opportunity to learn to read and write, and was enslaved later on before earning his freedom. It's also possible he demonstrated an aptitude for literacy while he was enslaved and had some sort of role as a slave that involved it. Maybe he was a teacher. It wasn't unheard of for teachers to be slaves. But the truth is, all we really know about Antoninus Liberalis is he wrote in Greek, but he had a Latin name. Chapter 2. Metamorphoses. Earlier, we talked about Ovid's Metamorphoses. It's certainly the most famous work with that title. No, Kafka's doesn't count because that's metamorphosis, singular. Metamorphoses is plural. Clearly, Antoninus Liberalis wrote a Metamorphoses. So did Apuleius. Have you ever read The Golden Ass? Originally, it was called Metamorphoses too. It's also full of transformation stories. It's mostly people turning into animals or living people turning into dead people. But there's no gender transformations. But there are a group of Galli who show up in Book 8, which is kind of neato. There are plenty of other magical transformation stories from the ancient world as well, but Ovid's and Antoninus's are the most interesting for us today. Both Ovid and Antoninus were heavily influenced by a work by the 2nd century BCE Greek writer Nicander of Colophon. It was called the Heteroeumena, which is Greek for, you guessed it, metamorphoses, because of course it is. This work is mostly lost, but we do have a few fragments that have survived. Antoninus and Ovid's Metamorphoses have some overlaps, but not entirely. Antoninus doesn't talk about Hermaphroditus, for example, and Ovid doesn't talk about Siproites. So either Nicander's work wasn't the only source for ancient transformation stories, or Ovid and Antoninus just decided they didn't like some of Nicander's stories and left them out. In fact, there's another source Antoninus probably drew on quite heavily, Boios. His work is also lost. We don't even have any fragments, but it seemed to be a catalog of the various transformations of people into birds in mythology. And thank the muses, it's not called metamorphoses. It's called ornithogonia. A fair number of Antoninus's transformations are about birds too, so it makes sense that he'd have drawn on this one. Anyway, Antoninus and Ovid are the two most significant sources of ancient transformation stories that survive today. But Ovid's work is creative, fun, and innovative. Different threads are woven together to connect different myths. The myth of Hermaphroditus, for example, is told along with several others in the context of the 2 daughters of Minyas weaving in honor of Athena, while the rest of the city of Thebes is celebrating Dionysus. The 2 sisters then tell each other's stories: Pyramus and Thisbe, the affair of Venus and Mars, Salmachus and Hermaphroditus, and others. It's part of a broader, creative narrative. On the other hand, Antoninus's stories are brief and lifeless. It's more of a summary of previous work than it is a unique take on it. Here's what happened in this story. Here's what happened in that story. Here's what happened in the other story, etc. That's a real drag because it leaves us with these wonderfully tantalizing little bits of mythology that don't appear anywhere else, but there's so little to go on as a result. The section involving Siproites is pretty short, so I'll read the whole thing here, in translation, of course, by Francis Caloria. Then we'll explore what little we could possibly glean from what we do know. It's not the only transy bit in this text, so clearly I've got to make some more videos about this at some point. Sometimes I wish there were 3 of me. Chapter 3. Metamorphoses, Book 17. Galatea, daughter of Eurytius, who was son of Spartan, married at Phaistos in Crete Pandion's son Lampris, a man of good family, but without means. When Galatea became pregnant, Lampris prayed to have a son and said plainly to his wife that she was to expose her child if it was a daughter. When Lampris had gone off to tend his flocks, Galatea gave birth to a daughter. Feeling pity for her babe, she counted on the remoteness of their house and, backed by dreams and seers telling her to bring up the girl as a boy, deceived Lampris by saying she had given birth to a son and brought the child up as a boy, giving it the name Leucippus. As the girl grew up, she became unutterably beautiful. Because it was no longer possible to hide this, Galatea, fearing Lampris, fled to the temple of Leto and made many a prayer to her that the child might become a boy instead of a girl, just as had happened to Caenis, daughter of Atrax, who by the will of Poseidon became Caenius the Lapith. So also Tiresias changed from man to woman because he had encountered and killed 2 snakes that had been mating at a crossroads. He changed again from woman back to man by killing another serpent. Hypermestra had frequently sold her body in the form of a woman for a fee, becoming a man to bring food for her father, Aethon. The Cretan Siproites had also been turned into a woman for having seen Artemis bathing when out hunting. Leto took pity on Galatea because of her unremitting and distressed prayers and changed the sex of the child into a boy's. In memory of this change, the citizens of Phaistos still sacrificed to Leto the grafter because she had grafted organs on the girl, and they gave her festival the name of Ecdysia, or stripping, because the girl had stripped off her maidenly peplus. It is now an observance in marriage to lie down beforehand beside the statue of Leucippus. Chapter 4. Angry Goddesses Messing with Men. I was really hoping to make this a shorter video. No, it's going to be a shorter video. We're manifesting the video of our dreams here. Not everything has to be dozens of pages long, Sophie. There are tons of gender transformations there. Who have we got here? Caenius, Leucippus, Tiresias, Hypermestra, and of course Siproites. Each of these deserves their own video. We'll get to them another time, I hope. I know this is the second time I've said that about Tiresias, but yeah, one of these days we'll get to their myths. You want me to get to it faster? Patreon in the description. This ain't my full-time job. I wish it were. Manifest some more cash in my pocket, and I can manifest more time to work on this stuff. But okay, Siproites. The Cretan Siproites had also been turned into a woman for having seen Artemis bathing when out hunting. That's all we got. And yeah, is that ever spicy? Where can we go with this? Actually, there are a few different threads we can pull on there. We've got the transformation itself, the fact that it was Artemis who did it, and the fact that Siproites was a Cretan. First of all, the circumstances of Siproites' transformation aren't terribly uncommon. Goddesses get mad when men see them bathing in the forest pretty often. Actaeon is a great example of this. His story shows up in quite a few sources, and as usual, each telling says something different. But the way Ovid tells it, Actaeon was out hunting and accidentally saw Artemis bathing, just like Siproites. As a result, she changed him into a stag, and poor Actaeon was devoured by his own dogs. Why did Artemis not do the same with Siproites? We don't know. One version of Tiresias's myth from Callimachus's hymns is basically the same premise, but instead of Artemis, it's Athena he sees, and instead of being turned into a stag, he's blinded. Pseudo-Plutarch talks about another similar myth in De Fluviis, a work that explores the mythology, geography, and biology of 25 different rivers. In Book 22 on the Aeschylus River in Epirus, we learn about Calydon, the son of Mars and Astynome. He accidentally saw Artemis bathing in the river, so she transformed him into a rock. As a result, they changed the name of the nearby mountain to Calydon as well. So if you ever see the most beautiful woman you've ever seen in a river bathing, avert your eyes because it's probably my girlfriend. Give her some privacy, you perv. Gosh, I love her. And if it's not her, you should probably still avert your eyes, because it seems like your options are A, be blinded, B, be turned into a stag, C, be turned into a rock, or D, be turned into a woman. And if that last one sounds appealing to you, I get it. It's more appealing to me too, clearly, but there are far less risky ways to make that happen. Chapter 5. Cretan Mythology. Okay, what else do we know? Siproites was from Crete, and that is pretty notable. If you've not heard of Crete before, oh boy, it's a lot of fun. Crete is an island in the Aegean Sea. It's the 5th largest. Sicily, Sardinia, Cyprus, and Corsica are larger. And it was also the home of the Minoan civilization, which is arguably the first actual civilization in Europe. They began somewhere around 3100 BCE and stuck around with various highs and lows until the Bronze Age collapse around 1075 BCE. In particular, they're known for their large, elaborate, completely awesome palaces. Knossos is the most famous, but it's not the only one. There's so much to say about the Minoan civilization that I'm sure you could create an entire channel around them. I haven't bothered to look, but I'm sure they exist. The Minoans left behind tons of fantastic art and architecture, and a lot of writing too. Hundreds of tablets, in fact. Is there anything in there that could help us understand Siproites? From what we can tell, the Minoans had 3 different written languages: Minoan hieroglyphics, Linear A, and Linear B. As far as Minoan hieroglyphics go, we can't do much in terms of translating them. There are too few pieces surviving to give us much to go on. We have quite a bit more Linear A tablets, but thus far scholars have been unable to translate them either. So what's written in Linear A? What's written in Minoan hieroglyphics? Could we be sitting on a treasure trove of preserved epic tales, each tablet its own Iliad, just waiting to be deciphered? Probably not. See, we have been able to translate its successor language, Linear B, and its contents are mostly palace records. Tallies of grain, wool, sheep, that sort of thing. It's pretty boring stuff, to be honest. But either way, it's unlikely the classical era Greeks or the Romans could read it any better than we can. Scholar E.J. Forsythe mentions an anecdote in Plutarch where King Agesilaus II of Sparta finds a grave in Boeotia where a bronze tablet is buried. He didn't know how to decipher it, but he thought it looked like Egyptian hieroglyphics, so he sent a copy of it to Egypt to see if they know what it said. And I mean, if you squint and tilt your head and drink a couple of fingers of scotch, Minoan scripts do kind of look like Egyptian hieroglyphics, in I guess the same way that this looks like a crab, or this looks like a swan, or this looks like a queen on the throne. These never made any sense to me. Hercules and Orion, okay, I can see that, but how is this a ram? I don't get it. Anyway, consider the frame of reference of a Spartan king from the 4th century BCE. Egyptian hieroglyphics would have been the closest thing he'd know to this. This anecdote is probably referring to Linear B, considering where it was discovered, but they probably couldn't read Linear A or the Minoan hieroglyphics either. Besides, the Minoans stopped using Linear B around 1450 BCE, from what we can tell, and the other 2 earlier than that. For reference, it would be around 1,000 years before Plato, Herodotus, and the classical Greek writers showed up. Linear A would make about as much sense to them as Beowulf does to the average person today. So, whatever secrets remain sealed behind Minoan hieroglyphics and Linear A likely won't help us understand Siproites. But that's not all we've got. In fact, there's plenty of classical mythology centered on Crete as well. Obviously, there's a lot to do with bulls. We see bull motifs all over the place in Cretan art. We even know they played some sort of bull jumping game, though we don't know the details of it. That's clearly where the story of King Minos and the Minotaur comes from. The labyrinth part we think comes from just how bloody big and complex the Cretan palaces were. If you didn't know any better, you might think they were a maze, especially if you stumbled upon them centuries after they were abandoned. But Antoninus Liberalis doesn't say anything about a bull or a palace, so that doesn't help much one way or another. Back in the video on the Galli, we talked about baby Zeus being hidden away after he was born. Hungry Kronos was told his son would overthrow him as ruler of the universe. So every time his wife Cybele gave birth to a new child, Kronos would devour them. And that's what happened with the first 5 kids, but when it was Zeus's time, Cybele gave Kronos a boulder to eat instead, which he did. After, Cybele hid Zeus in a cave, where he stayed until he grew to be an adult, and overthrew Kronos. That cave was on Crete, but baby Zeus cried, as babies sometimes do. So Cybele's devotees made a lot of noise as they worshipped near the cave to drown it out, which might be the reason why the Galli were so fond of loud, ecstatic worship in Rome. But that doesn't give us much to go on with Siproites either. Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, was worshipped at Phaistos, another Minoan palace. Antoninus Liberalis himself told us that in the passage we read earlier. That, too, was related to a gender transformation. In that case, it was Leucippus's mother praying to Leto to change her child into a man. So, okay, there's some gender happening on Crete. But that story isn't related to seeing a goddess bathing. It was a deliberate transformation by a goddess who took pity on a human family. Earlier, we talked about 4 different mythological men who saw goddesses bathing and their various fates. Actaeon was turned into a stag and torn to pieces, Tiresias was blinded, Calydon was turned into a rock, and Siproites was turned into a woman. Now, from a mythological perspective, being turned into a woman was generally considered to be a bad thing, a punishment. But even so, it's clear to see Siproites' fate was kind of the least bad of them. And yes, I know my audience, and I know my personal biases. Chances are if you're watching this, you'd choose Siproites' fate over the others as well. But even if you were the ancient equivalent of a cis man, you'd probably rather be a woman than be dead. Tiresias is, I think, the only one that might give you some pause. Could Siproites' lighter sentence, relatively speaking, be related to the fact that they're Cretan? Possibly. Siproites might have been a devoted follower of Artemis who had the misfortune of stumbling upon her bathing. Artemis might have recognized she had to punish Siproites, but because of his devotion to her, perhaps she simply turned Siproites into a woman. After all, Artemis's followers, her huntresses, saw her naked as she bathed all the time, and it wasn't a problem. It was only men who were forbidden from seeing such things. But here's the thing. Gender transformations in Greek mythology aren't just taking a man's brain and sticking it into a woman's body. They seem to transform both body and mind. In the stories where Tiresias was transformed into a woman, she seemed to largely take it in stride. She became a priestess of Hera, the one who turned her into a woman in the first place. She married a man and even had a daughter by him before being turned back into a man 7 years later. Perhaps something similar happened with Siproites. Perhaps she became one of Artemis's huntresses, continuing her devotion to the goddess who punished her and continuing to hunt along with her sisters, forever living and hunting together. Or perhaps not, we don't know. Chapter 6. Really, is that it? Unfortunately, yeah, that's it. Ancient history and mythology are like that sometimes. Tantalizing, but ultimately disappointing, the story of Siproites is unmistakably transgender mythology. There are things we know that we know. There are things we don't know that we don't know. And there are things we know that we don't know. The story of Siproites falls into that last category. If not for Antoninus Liberalis, though, Siproites would have joined the countless myths who've been lost to the sands of time altogether. At least we've got something. And should we ever find a manuscript of Nicander's works, perhaps we can build on that little tidbit that we do know. But for now, that's all we know. So what does this story tell us? It tells us that stories about people like us, whether in reality or in mythology, have been around for a very long time. Nicander's Metamorphoses doesn't survive, but 2 of his other works do, and from there we can glean enough information to think he wrote sometime during the 2nd century BCE. Certainly not the oldest thing we've looked at on this series, but not the newest either. Was Nicander the originator of the Siproites story? We don't know that either, but mythological stories are often older than the sources we have for them. Either way, people were thinking about and writing about gender transformations for thousands of years. This little bit of Antoninus Liberalis's work gives us 5 different examples of that: Leucippus, Caeneus, Tiresias, Hypermestra, and Siproites. Whether through divine punishment or through estrogen-soaked cheese snacks, through fusion with an obsessed lover, or through division of self with a dagger, the ancient Mediterranean is full of transgender stories. We have always existed, and so long as humanity continues to endure, so too shall we. This is cat number 4, though I haven't, numbered them or anything. This is Button, aka Ella. We've seen her already. I was holding her in my lap in the Inari remastered video when I was talking about being a witch. This is Bean's sister. I think we looked at her in the Hypsicrates video. Anyway, we do have a 5th cat that hasn't shown up at all, but she's the most difficult to put into a situation where it looks nice to film her, so we don't have her yet. But thanks to Button for showing up here, thanks to you for watching, and thanks especially to the following Patreon supporters.